All right, indeed, and this is where we start. Struggle stalwart and former PAC president Dr. Motsoko Pheko is being laid to rest this morning. So throughout his life, Dr. Pheko was a staunch advocate for the Pan-Africanist ideology and dedicated decades of his life to the fight against apartheid. So his contribution was not limited to political activism. He was also an author, lawyer, historian and academic. After the end of apartheid, Dr. Pheko continued to serve his country as a member of parliament for 10 years and also representing the PAC at the United Nations. He passed away 2 weeks ago, aged 93. We'll show you live pictures from that at the moment. And I think we'll be crossing to my colleague Mbalenhle Mthethwa, who's in Rosebank in Johannesburg. She's live for us there. Mbalenhle, a very good morning to you. Thanks indeed for your time. Certainly a life being remembered today who made a significant contribution to the South Africa that we see today. Tell us more.
Well, we have witnessed what is the final send-off for the farewell ceremony for Dr. Motsoko Pheko, who has lived a full life fighting for the liberation of South Africa. Now, what we've heard so far from one of the representatives who are here and someone who has served within the PAC is the former deputy chairperson for the Pan-Africanist Congress's Women's League, who is also the MC today. It is Crescentia Mofokeng, who spoke about, what the doctor would say when he speaks or meets Mangaliso Sobukwe in heaven, when he is asked about the land. And now you'll know that the PAC is a stern advocate for the restoration of land to the people. Mofokeng saying that land is dignity. But in response to that question to Dr. Mangaliso Sobukwe, she said that the doctor would say that the struggle continues as people continue living in squalor, living in shacks with no land, and just stressing the need for the restoration of the land to the people. I'm joined by a family friend and a family spokesperson who's going to talk to us and give us a better sense of the life and times of Dr. Motsoko Pheko. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us. To many people, Dr. Motsoko Pheko, he is a Pan-Africanist, he is a leader, he is an academic, he's an author, but to the family, he's completely different. He is a father, he is an uncle, he is, a friend. How will you remember him?
Thank you so much. I think essentially that Motsoko Pheko is a father, and he's somebody who is loved by many. And I think as a family, we have had to share him with not only our relatives, but also with the rest of the ideological family, the Azanian family, the Pan-Africanist family. And so it would be, I think, amiss for us to speak about Ntate Motsoko Pheko only as our biological, father and relative, as friends of the family, but to also remember him as the revolutionary stalwart that he is, and the person who courageously during apartheid and post-1994 stood firm against, resurfacing the question of land dispossession for the African people. But also, I think as a scholar, he's somebody who has taught us how to marry our activism into our intellectual works, and as activists, as academics, but as also as young people who are asking these questions about our lived realities, as black people 30 years into democracy. For us, Ntate Motsoko Pheko remained as that uncompromising, courageous, fearless voice of the Azanian people, especially young black people.
And when you speak of a fearless voice, we saw a video of him accepting his doctorate an honorary doctorate from the University of South Africa, where he yet again reiterates his stance on the land and the call for land redistribution. Do you think how will his legacy or his name be remembered in South Africa and the world?
Certainly in South Africa, he will be remembered, as you've said, and I've also just mentioned, one of the most uncompromising Pan-Africanists that centered the land dispossession question. Of course, he mentioned it in Parliament, even against, the parliamentarians who were there. I mean, we've seen footages, from the past where he was muted, somebody shouting that the mic must be muted when this man is putting across the issues that concern black people that dispossess. So he'll certainly be remembered as someone who has put the land question at the center at a time when it was not even fashionable to do so. And UNISA, I think, as the University of South Africa, when they recognized him as and offered him the doctorate, I think they were only, doing justice to a voice that has been ignored, a voice that has been pushed to the margins. But even as has happened, I think that Motsoko Pheko has insisted to stay in the center because he did not only become a politician, but also he was an author, a publisher, something that he has done in the past. I mean, he founded a university, co-founded a university in Kenya, and he was also an editor of a publication, and he's also over 45 books. That is a lifetime, I think, achievement, something that is worthy of recognition. And I hope that going forward, institutions of higher learning would obviously take on the baton by centering his works, his body of works, into the curriculum that is being offered.
Speaking of the body of his work and him being remembered, do you believe that enough is being done to preserve his legacy and to preserve, his teachings? I mean, if he has written books on history, on African history, and obviously come up with some very real ideas that could be used in modern day society. Do you think enough is being done to just ensure that, his legacy is not forgotten?
If we think about what the man stood for, which is the return of the land to the dispossessed, and we are talking 30 years later, and the discourse and the conversation around that very question, policy around that very question, keeps, being reversed, it keeps being put to the back seat. And therefore, I think the question of how he should be remembered should be tied to the question of the land. If the land is not remembered, if the land is not returned, then it becomes quite tricky for us to, forget him. I think we'll only forget him when the land is returned. Perhaps even when the land is returned, it will be because of his efforts and he will be put in the center. So the question of how he should be remembered should be tied, I think, to the land question, because that's what the man stood for. That's what the man sacrificed for during apartheid and in the post-1994 context. Of course, we in the PAC, in the African Azanian school of thought, we do not recognize post-1994 as a moment of freedom, as a moment of change, but rather continuities. We still are aware, and also the works of Motsoko Pheko has made us to understand that the dynamics of apartheid have continued through the democratic dispensation, and neocolonialism is very much a living fact in the lives of the dispossessed. And so when we think about remembering him, we need to go back to his works. We need to also understand that none of us are free until the land is returned to its original owners.
Now, when you say that South Africa, post-1994 South Africa moved from apartheid South Africa, which was a very unfortunate part of the South African history, which saw many people losing their lives, and into a neocolonialism. What exactly would you say characterizes neocolonialism? Because for some, it meant an end to the brutal rule of apartheid, which is obviously a win and a victory in many people's minds. But how is it then a continuation of the struggle if that brutality was done away with?
I think, again, if we center the land question, we then get to understand why is it that the post-1994 arrangement was but a mere compromise. Because if you think about it, many people and many historians who are liberal in their thinking believe that, we subverted a civil war by compromising and negotiating our sovereignty as a people, negotiating our dignity as black people. But if you look if you scratch the surface just a little bit, you will see that, we might have averted a civil war, but we have not stopped the violence. Black people are dying in townships. We are dying, even in our schools and university. I mean, young black children are dying from drowning in toilets. I mean, what kind of freedom is that? What kind of liberation is that? Did we perhaps compromise a bit, too much? Did we sacrifice ourselves as a people, in those negotiations? And of course, Dr. Motsoko Pheko is very clear about, firstly, the role of the Pan-Africanist Congress and what it means to serve, suffer, and sacrifice. And we believe that these were some of the principles, these were some of the goals that were sacrificed in the negotiating tables when people settled, for the Rainbow Nation that does not center blackness, a Rainbow Nation that does not center who we are as black people. I mean, black people in the world are still oppressed, and it will be amiss of us in South Africa, especially as a country that was the last one to receive, its independence. We've not really learned from those who got their independence before us, because we continually make the same mistakes, the mistakes of entrusting our our sovereignty to politicians and not really centering, people. People are still suffering, yet we are forced to push those under the carpet, and we are really forced to enjoy some of the very mere goals or mere achievements of what has been known as the South African liberation. In the PAC and of course in the broader Azanian school of thought, we still say not yet Uhuru, and this is what the legacy of Dr. Motsoko Pheko centers.
Okay. Now, we are leading up to the elections, national and provincial elections, just later this month, and would you say that would you encourage people to vote if, you believe that the country is not yet Uhuru and the freedom has not come, and who's to blame for this?
Of course, elections are a site of struggle. I believe that, those who are open to participating in that site of struggle should be allowed to do so. And but if you look at the history, and this conversation has come up in a lot of the memorials that we've had with the PAC. I mean, the very first election in 1994, the PAC comes out there saying that, there was no justice done for them. In fact, they question even the processes that led out to the issuing of the results. Of course, they've spoken about, ballots that went missing. I think there's still a very serious historical injustice that was done in the very first election, because most of the people, especially those in the PAC, believe that they were well within the majority, but the outcomes of the elections did not reflect what was on the ground. And I think that discourse, that narrative, has continued throughout all the elections. And so I think it remains to be seen about how the IEC itself, because 30 years later, I think it remains a body that has, lost its credibility. There are certain things that it should have done differently to sort of address, these concerns that, other political parties have raised. But at the same time, South Africans are not strangers to, entrusting their power to politicians, but at the end of the day, walking out with literally nothing but empty promises. I mean, I think there's still that tradition of, making promises to people, but not delivering. But at the same time, not also empowering the people themselves in order to understand how to then, hold their representatives accountable, because democracy is supposed to be, about the people. But in South Africa, at least in the 30 years that we've seen, democracy has essentially become the exclusive preserve of politicians and those who have influence.
Now, speaking on the IEC, and the outcome and the results during the 1994 elections, the IEC has come out quite strongly against those who are questioning the credibility of the IEC. And one of the major concerns is, in questioning the credibility and the results thereof, could really spark unhappiness on the ground, and there's obviously concerns that this is a part of spreading misinformation, because they keep reiterating that the results are free and fair, the elections are free and fair and credible, and they ensure that this is the case, and they have all these checks and balances that they have put in place in order to ensure that it is so. But do you think there's also an element of unhappiness from those who find that the results did not favor them and therefore accuse the IEC of not being credible?
I think for me, the most important thing is to perhaps rethink how we've been doing things, both on the aspect of political education and just getting people to understand what the relationship ought to be between the IEC, which is the highest electoral body, and the ordinary people who are on the ground. And I think that work has not been done, and perhaps it's something that the IEC should look forward to. Instead of only, I suppose, being present during the election year, there should be serious work that goes on, before the elections that, addresses some of these questions and concerns, because, we cannot, 30 years later, continue to carry a body, an electoral body that remains questionable in some quarters of the political parties.
Okay. Thank you so much for speaking to us. There you have it. That is a family representative speaking to us on the legacy of Dr. Motsoko Pheko. The funeral service continues inside. It is back to you in studio.
Mbalenhle Mthethwa, thank you very much indeed. SABC News reporter Mbalenhle Mthethwa at the Rosebank Union Church in Sandton here in Johannesburg, where the funeral service for the late Dr. Motsoko Pheko is currently underway.